I'm getting close to my retirement date, so I've been thinking about what it's going to be like to be retired. I've been thinking how nice it'll be to have an empty calendar, but I've also been worried. What am I going to do to fill up my time? And I've been worried about, are we going to have enough money to do what we want to do? Of course, we've made a budget, and rationally, in my mind, I know it'll be all right, but there's still this fear about not having enough, a fear of scarcity. But then I think back on times in my life when I was happiest, and really there were the times in my life when I had the least money. When I was a young guy and I was riding my motorcycle up to Idaho for my first Forest Service job, and I had $25 in my pocket. I was happy. Or when I lived in a tent all summer for 5 years, working on the chainsaw in Alaska, I was happy. Or when we were raising our little boys and just starting out at the shipyard and a small salary, and we had everything we needed. We were happy. It's not the amount of money that makes you happy. There was a study done in 2010 by Princeton University that showed people's happiness increased as their income increased up to a point, up to about $75,000, they said. And above $75,000, no matter how much more money you made, you didn't get any happier. And I guess what that shows is that it sucks to be poor. You know, if you've ever gone to bed without a meal, or if you've had to choose between buying food or buying medication, you know what that's like. It's not easy to be poor. And it's not always that great to be rich either. If you're rich, you got to worry about taxes and investments and properties and people taking advantage of you. It's not always that easy to be rich either. You know that as your wealth increases, your expectations increase, and it's getting harder and harder to meet your expectations. So you're not necessarily any happier. You know, money is such a strange thing. We have so much emotional content tied up with our relationship to money. You know, money is like water. It just flows down through society. There's money everywhere. It's like a system of pipes. Some people got big pipes. Some people just have little tiny pipes. Some people turn on the tap and the water just gushes out. Some people turn on the tap and they only get a couple of drops. In our epistle this morning from James, he talks about the rich and the poor and our attitudes about the rich and the poor. James is writing to new Christians. This is the very earliest time in the church, and people need to be taught what it means to be Christians and how you live out the Christian life. So he's trying to teach them. He says, suppose that you're meeting as a church and a rich person comes in with gold and fine clothes, and you just fall all over yourselves to take care of this rich person. Come sit up here in the best seat. Do you need anything? And suppose a poor person comes in with dirty clothes, and you say to them, go sit in the back, or you can leave now. Haven't you made distinctions among yourselves? And haven't you become judges with evil thoughts? Judges with evil thoughts. What James is saying is that for some reason, we look up to the rich and we look down on the poor. Why is that? Well, some people say it's because the rich have worked hard and they've taken risks and they've made sacrifices and they deserve to be rich. And the poor are lazy and they deserve to be poor. I think there's probably more to it than that. I think the reason we look up to the rich and look down on the poor is projection. We project ourselves onto the rich and onto the poor, and that's why we look at them differently. We look at the rich and we want to be like them. We imagine what it would be like if we had that much money. If I had that much money, I wouldn't have to worry. I could buy anything I want. And so basically it's envy that makes us admire them. Same thing with the poor. When we see a poor person, we project ourselves onto that poor person. We imagine that what it would be like if we were poor, and we recoil from that. We're horrified. I could never be like that. And so we put them underneath us. You know, when I come up to the stoplight and I see a homeless person asking for money, I don't feel anger or contempt. What I feel is embarrassment. I think if I were there, standing there asking for money, I would be so embarrassed. But that's just me projecting my feelings on that person. They don't necessarily feel that way. So I try to just put it out of my mind. So we worship the rich and we despise the poor because of our feelings about money and our own feelings about ourselves. James says, don't you know that God honors the poor? And don't you know that it's the poor who God has chosen to have faith? If you want to look for people with faith, don't look at the mansions in Hollywood, but look in the poorest parts of the country. That's where you're going to find faith. And James says, don't you know it's the rich who oppress you? It's the rich who drag you into jail. It's the rich who blaspheme the name of God. So what James is saying is that our feelings about the rich and the poor are all messed up. And the guideline he says to use is this: love your neighbor as yourself. The rich aren't any more important than you are, and the poor aren't any less important than you are. Everyone is equal in the sight of God. We are all children of God, equally worthy. So love your neighbor as yourself. You know, sometimes I wonder if our country isn't too prosperous, if we don't have too much money. And you say, well, no, you can never have too much money. We always want to grow the gross national product, and a rising tide lifts all boats. There's never enough money. But I wonder. 2 weeks ago, there was an op-ed in the Kitsap Sun by Tom Nichols. And what he said is that the greatest threat to democracy is us, we the people. He says we have gotten so used to having more products, better products, and more choices that we become pampered. Our prosperity has allowed us to isolate ourselves from each other and live separately. And so we don't need each other anymore. And we've lost sight of the common good, and we've lost our sense of public responsibility. You know, prosperity has bred a culture of entitlement and narcissism. He says that the rioters on January 6th at the Capitol, they weren't oppressed people who were protesting injustice. They were a bunch of middle-class, middle-aged, gainfully employed people who went back the next week to their jobs and then bragged about what they did on Instagram. He says that we're suffering because we're successful. And we're unhappy because we have what we want. So maybe we're too prosperous for our own good. If you had to choose between equality and prosperity for our country, what would you choose? Well, I know we all say we want to have both prosperity and equality. But if you had to choose, which one would you choose? And I wonder if maybe our nation hasn't already made a choice that prosperity is more important than equality. Well, the letter of James shows us that the very earliest church was really that equality was really important for the early church. They were very egalitarian. In the sight of God, everyone is the same, rich and poor, men and women, Jew and Gentile. Didn't stay that way very long. It became hierarchical pretty soon, and it became super organized. But at the first, it was very egalitarian, and that's what James is trying to teach the people. Everyone is the same in the sight of God. There's a story about a church on Sunday morning. The people are in the pews, and the preacher's in the pulpit preaching. And in comes a young man with an old hoodie on, jeans and floppy tennis shoes, and comes right down the aisle. And he's obviously not in his right mind. Maybe he's mentally ill, or he's on something. And people are a little uncomfortable, not sure what's going to happen. He walks right up the aisle and sits down at the steps of the chancel underneath where the preacher is preaching. An old man gets up from the back and walks up the aisle. He's well-dressed, well-respected member of the congregation, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief because they figure he'll ask the man quietly to go to the back. But he doesn't do that. He goes up and he sits down next to the young man, and he sits there all the way through the sermon. And at the end of the service, he turns to him, shakes his hand, and says, "We're glad you're here." Isn't it funny how money and our emotions around money affect us? The one guide we have is love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.
Amen.